All right, good evening, everybody. My name is David Shirevitz. I'm here with my friend Nadell. We're going to be introducing tonight's program. It's really a wonderful pleasure to welcome everybody here tonight for the latest installment of the Manfred Gogol Memorial Lecture. I'm a professor in the history department as well as director of the Crown Family Center, and so for just a moment, I'm going to say a few words about our center, about Jewish and Israel studies on campus, and then turn things over to Michael and to our speakers. The Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies is an academic hub for undergraduate and graduate education, faculty and student research, and accessible and engaging public programming. Our students, affiliated faculty members, visiting professors, postdoctoral fellows, study, teach, and research about Jewish history, Jewish philosophy and thought, Hebrew and Yiddish language and literature, Holocaust studies, and the history, politics, and culture of the State of Israel. The Crown Family Center has about a dozen affiliated full-time faculty members, a robust group of visiting scholars and postdocs, an undergraduate major, 2 undergraduate minors, an interdisciplinary graduate cluster, so there's a lot going on. And we teach dozens of courses each year and enroll many hundreds of Northwestern students. It would be wonderful for those who have not been to programming here in the past or don't know that much about what we offer to learn more about our center. Go to our website. You can follow us on social media and see more at the registration table about ways to get in touch, to stay posted about upcoming events, and to learn about ways that you can partner with us. Now, I'll just point out that the courses and programming that we do in Jewish and Israel Studies are really aimed at the entire Northwestern University community. Our courses enroll students who have all different kinds of backgrounds, and so we work with a lot of different partners on campus, Middle East and North African studies, history, gender studies, theater, Nadell, and many more. But it's really a particular privilege tonight to get to partner on this program with Northwestern Hillel. He works to support and educate and provide a home for Jewish students on campus. I'm sure Michael will have much more to say about that. The topic of tonight's presentation, Antisemitism in American History, is one that is of vital academic importance, but it also speaks to questions that the Jewish community as a whole have been grappling with, especially over the past 2 years. And really it's a privilege to get to host a speaker who is an important voice within the scholarly realm, but also who has been really an important voice in the broader Jewish community as well. And I'll just conclude this section by saying that Manfred Gogol, who was a rabbi and professor, instrumental in setting up Jewish studies here at Northwestern, actually originally served as the director of Northwestern Hillel as Rabbi Gogol, before eventually going on to complete his doctorate and to serve for many decades as a professor of religious studies, and he was really the founding force behind what was then called the Center for Jewish Studies at Northwestern. So getting to work together with our friends at Hillel, a program like this one seems like a really especially fitting way to honor his memory tonight. Okay, now on to the main event. I'm going to be introducing our speaker, and then Michael's going to be speaking and introducing the second participant in tonight's dialogue. Professor Pamela Nadell is Patrick Clarendon Chair in Women's and Gender History and in Jewish Studies at American University in Washington, D.C. She is the author of 9 books. I'm not going to list all of them or all of the awards that they won. For your selection, they include America's Jewish Women, A History from Colonial Times to Today, which won the National Jewish Book Award, the Jewish Book of the Year. She's also the author of Women Who Would Be Rabbis, A History of Women's Ordination, 1889 to 1985, finalist also for the National Jewish Book Award. She's an acclaimed teacher. She's won American University's Scholar Teacher of the Year Award. She is somebody who, in addition to her classical work and her academic publications, also has been a really important public voice within the field of Jewish studies, and even beyond this, so she served as the past president of the Association for Jewish Studies. She consults to museums, including Tel Aviv's New Anu Museum, the Weizmann National Museum of American Jewish History in Philadelphia, and has been at work on the Pittsburgh Tree of Life complex. I also learned from reading the bio that she was the 4th person on a congressional panel that included the presidents of Harvard, MIT, and the University of Pennsylvania. If, like me, over the last few years, you've been following events in Congress and in Jewish studies, that's a kind of an iconic historical moment. And so, in addition to being a participant in that important space and talking about Jewish studies and anti-Semitism in the congressional world, really the Iowa University counts to history. Her new book is Antisemitism in American tradition. We're going to be hearing much more about that subject in just a moment, and it's really on behalf of the Crown Center a wonderful and privilege to get to offer here to campus. And now I'll turn things over to Michael, who will conclude the introduction.
Thank you, David. I'm Michael Simon. I'm the Executive Director of Northwestern Hillel. It is my honor and pleasure to join my wonderful friend and colleague David Shivitz and the Crown Family Center for Jewish and Israel Studies in welcoming you all to tonight's Vogel lecture featuring Pamela Nadell in conversation with Daniel Green. In a moment, I'll introduce Daniel. It's hard for me to say Daniel because I know him as Danny, but we're here in this environment, so he's Daniel. And I first want to share a few words about Hillel. Hillel is the center of Jewish life at this great university and the catalyst for Jewish expression of all kinds. Our mission is to inspire every Jewish student at Northwestern to make a meaningful and enduring commitment to Jewish life, and we work to enrich the lives of our Jewish students so they may enrich the campus, the Jewish community, and the world. Hillel provides a safe haven for students, but being a safe space is not enough. We also foster a brave space that instills in our students the courage to explore not only their Judaism, but also what it means to be Jewish and human, to be Jewish and American, to have a relationship with Israel, and to grapple with controversial topics on campus and in the world. One way we do this is by bringing speakers to campus who model how to address complex questions about the world through rigorous and clear-eyed inquiry. We are thus tremendously fortunate to feature speakers whose work and whose topic tonight is of tremendous, urgent relevance. Well, you've already heard about Pamela, so I now want to introduce the terrific colleague who will be in conversation with her. Daniel Green is a historian and curator at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum and adjunct professor of history here at Northwestern. Danny Green curated Americans and the Holocaust, an exhibition that opened in 2018 at the Holocaust Memorial Museum in Washington, D.C. to commemorate its 25th anniversary. The exhibition also inspired the U.S. and the Holocaust, an Emmy-winning documentary film directed by Ken Burns, Lynn Novick, and Sarah Bodstein that premiered on PBS in September 2022. He co-edited with Edward Phillips the book Americans and the Holocaust, a Reader, which was published by Rutgers University Press in 2022. Green also curated the exhibition A Dangerous Lie, The Protocols of the Elders of Zion, which opened at the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum in 2007. A couple quick words of logistics before I invite Pamela and Daniel up. First, the books, Pamela's book, are on sale outside, and at the end of the event, feel free to purchase a book, and Pamela will be signing books at the end of the event. I also want to mention there will be time after Daniel and Pamela are in conversation for Q&A, and we're going to only take Q&A from the question cards that you can also, will come around if people want to write questions. And students will be prioritized. So students, and please, if you're a student, write student, otherwise don't put student, but put that on the questions. And with that, I think there's no other logistics, so please welcome Pamela and Daniel.
Thank you, David. Thank you, Michael. It's an honor to be here for for this year's iteration of the Vogel lecture. And Pam, it's wonderful to welcome you to Northwestern. Pam is just the type of generous scholar that you wish everyone would be. I've known Pam for decades, and she has always been there to be a conversation about difficult topics, to look to create opportunities for colleagues. She's just a model with that. So it's wonderful to welcome you here. Congratulations on the book, and welcome to Northwestern.
Oh, thank you, and I'm so delighted that the Crown Center and Hillel joined together to model this. And you should know that Danny and I have been in, I'm going to use Danny, right? Danny and I have had multiple conversations, and we continue to work together on projects. And so this has actually been one of the conversations I've most looked forward to, because we're just going to continue.
Thank you. So tell everyone why you wrote this book. Why do we need there's a lot of books on American anti-Semitism. Why do we need a new book now on American anti-Semitism?
I would actually push back. There aren't that many books on the history of American anti-Semitism. Yes, there are a lot of books on anti-Semitism. The first thing to say is that this is not a post-October 2nd book. I'm a historian. There are a lot of historians in the room. I only worked on this book for 6 years. That's not a long time for a historian. And this is really a book that was prompted first by Charlottesville, but then really by the murder of 11 Jews at worship on a Sabbath morning in October of 2018 at the Tree of Life Synagogue. And I don't know if you were you, I don't remember if you were part of this conversation, but there were a bunch of historians who were like, we were just shocked. How had we missed this story? And we began meeting, this is pre-Zoom, we began meeting at the Center for Jewish History. I was sitting in front of a computer, looking through a camera in a classroom at the Center for Jewish History, and we were all in trauma, just the way, as you and I know from working together on the rebuild of the Tree of Life, that the Pittsburgh Jewish community, and frankly, Pittsburgh, is in trauma. But what happened that day swirled out to our network, and it made me begin to wonder about this longer history.
And thinking of it then, not as what happened in Tree of Life, as a discontinuity, but as a continuity in American history.
Not only was it not, I mean, the level of violence was it just continuity, but thinking about the stories I began to hear. So what happened was we began meeting January, February of 2019. My last book that David so nicely mentioned, America's Jewish Women, came out that March. And I went out on book tour. And two things happened during that book tour. I was in conversation with a historian named Jonathan Udikin, who's written a lot about anti-Semitism.
Right,
And
at Washington University.
Right. And at one point, he said to me, anti-Semitism is all over your book. And I thought, no way, right? I wrote that book. I know what's in it. It's about Jewish women as activists and mothers and creators of Jewish communities and entering the workforce. But then I figured I needed to go back to see what I had written. In every single chapter, there was a story about a Jewish woman encountering anti-Semitism. And it made me realize that maybe I was thinking about anti-Semitism as constitutive of Jewish identity. And then, so while I was on book tour, I did what's the best part of a book tour, the Q&A, but I started to ask the audience questions. And I asked them if they had ever encountered anti-Semitism. And the stories that poured out absolutely stunned me. They poured out, sometimes in decades before, they were filled with angst and anguish and anger. And the way they told the stories, they told them as if they had happened yesterday. And that really, those two events led me to think about writing this book.
It's interesting because American Jewish historians, I think, have spent a lot of time debating amongst each other whether the United States has been an exceptional place for Jews, right? We talk about this exceptionalism narrative that imagines Jews as more welcome in the United States than they have ever been in any other country, anywhere, at any time in history, and also as more safe from anti-Semitism than they've been in other places. So where, after writing this book, do you come down on this question of American exceptionalism? Is the United States an exceptional place for Jews? And are you trying to change people's minds about that state of?
I don't know that I'm trying to change people's minds. I'd love to hear what you think, honestly, about the exceptionalism argument. For me, what I felt happened was that there were these terrific grand narratives, like Jonathan Sarna's American Judaism. And those grand narratives had not really focused on anti-Semitism. And I don't see this book as a new grand narrative of the American Jewish experience. I see it as a corrective or a complement to some of these other grand narratives, that these were stories that for some reason had gotten forgotten. And we know the last great book on this subject was Leonard Dinerstein's in 1994, It's called Antisemitism in America. And as late as 2016, Ditterstein was still saying and publishing that anti-Semitism in the US is so insignificant that American Jews don't see it, feel it, or hear it.
Why do you think we missed that story?
We missed it for some good reasons. We missed it because that period after World War II, things didn't change immediately, but after World War II, all the structural discriminations that had really impeded Jewish life. The quotas that had started at colleges and universities and eventually extended to 700 schools. I don't know, did Northwestern have one?
Yes.
Yeah, okay, my university didn't. At least they claimed they didn't, but 700 schools, so there were quotas limiting Jewish access. And then there were all these want ads that were in the paper, and they read Christians only. Nobody knows what a want ad is today. It was not the students in the room, but that was how you found a job. And employment agencies could say Christians only because they knew that nobody would hire Jews in those places. And then there were also these restrictive housing covenants, and they were written into the deeds, and you couldn't rent a house or buy a house in certain neighborhoods. And the stories that I found about this were amazing. Famous people like Catherine Graham, I don't know, maybe you know who Catherine Graham was, but she was the editor of the Washington Post. But when she first got married, she is about to buy a house. This happens to be in the neighborhood where my university is, because she described it as behind a Sears Roebuck, which was some kind of store that sold appliances and other things. And
Chicago-based.
Yeah, Chicago-based, but I don't think it exists anymore, does it? Yeah. So she's about to buy it. They're about to close on this house, and all of a sudden, her real estate agent says, "You can't live there because you're of Jewish descent." Her father was Eugene Mayer. He was a Jew. She was an Episcopalian. But she wrote about the anti-Semitism that she had faced, by the way, also when she was a student at the University of Chicago. And so, but those discriminations fell because of federal legislation.
And one of the things that really stood out for me in reading the second time around was, I think historians have told the story of American anti-Semitism mostly as a social prejudice, and then often as a religious prejudice. But what jumps out in your book is that it's often been enshrined in law. And I wonder if you could talk about just some examples of laws that enshrine anti-Semitism and may put them into some context among other prejudicial laws in U.S. history.
Well, the reason that the structural discriminations fell was because of the 1964 Civil Rights Act, as well as Fair Employment Acts and Fair Housing Acts and Fair Educational Acts as well. And those were part of the huge battle in the long civil rights movement. And it ended up benefiting, obviously, African Americans, but it also ended up benefiting Jews. But I think, and you know this better than I from your work on the exhibit, Americans in the Holocaust, and from the film, but the decision to restrict immigration in the United States, the National Origins Act of 1964, when you read the congressional...
1924.
Oh, sorry, 1924, yes, sorry. It ends in 65. When you read the congressional legislation about that, and what the committee was saying, the anti-Semitism pours out. They did not want poor East European Jews coming in. And then what happens when we get to the 1930s? Those laws keep Anne Frank out of America, right?
And you tell a much longer history too of legal discrimination
Right.
against Jews. I mean, this book starts quite early. I wonder if you can. It's always a difficult decision to figure out where to start and where to end. I imagine in this environment it was very difficult to figure out where to end and when to stop. Right, but also how did you figure out where to start this narrative?
Right. It was easy to start because it starts the minute 23 Jews land in New Amsterdam in 1654, and they're fleeing the Inquisition that's about to be reintroduced into Brazil, and the Jews have to, there have been a change of imperial ownership. When Brazil was Portuguese, the Jews were not allowed for a brief period of time. The Dutch controlled it, so Jews went in. The minute the Portuguese get back, they're very generous. They give the Jews 3 months to get out of the country, and otherwise they're going to execute them, or bring them before the Inquisition. And so they get to New Amsterdam, and the governor is Peter Stuyvesant. So if there are any New Yorkers in the room, you know that in New York City, there's a high school named for Peter Stuyvesant. Lots and lots of Jews graduated from there. Probably none of them ever knew that Stuyvesant wrote a letter to the Dutch West India Company in Amsterdam, which owned the colony and which set its policies. And he said that he wanted to expel this deceitful race, such hateful enemies and blasphemers of the name of Christ. And then he threw in for good measure that they were usurers and they were unfair traders. He even talked about them infecting the colony, which for me echoed the charges that the Jews had caused the Black Death, and about the only medieval anti-Semitic canard he didn't have was the blood libel. But that's okay because there were a lot of ministers in colonial America who raised it.
So a lot of these anti-Semitic lies that you just mentioned, right, blood libel and others, function as a conspiracy theory, right? And this notion of conspiracy theory is a thread that really runs through this book. Can you just kind of help us understand what does it mean to say that anti-Semitism functions as a conspiracy theory? And then is there something particular in the United States about how it functions as a conspiracy theory?
So the first thing to say is the idea of the Jews conspiring against others really goes back, and one way you could, I suppose, read it is you could read it all the way back to Exodus. But I would, make stops along the way, the Jews calling for the death of Jesus, the way the Gospels tell the story, and then the blood libel. For those of you who might not know what that is, that's the canard that Jews ritually murder a Christian child every year around Passover in order to use the child's blood for their rituals. And in the very first blood libel accusation, 1144, William of Norwich in England, the account was written by a monk named Thomas. And in Thomas of Monmouth's account, he actually says that once a year, the Jews get together and they decide which town is going to permit the annual sacrifice. So the point is that the idea of Jews conspiring, whether it's against Christians, it's against the Pharaoh, the notion of conspiracy seems to be deeply rooted in Jewish history.
Mm-hmm. And conspiracy functions as kind of a closed circle, right? That anything that happened, if you believe in a conspiracy, then anything that happened you can attribute to the conspiracy, right? So you get these contradictions in anti-Semitism, right? Whether it's Jews are clannish or Jews secretly infiltrated society, right? Or classic, right? Jews are capitalists and Jews are communists, right? A conspiracy provides an explanation, provides a simple explanation for anything that happens. So how does one fight back against conspiratorial thinking? I mean, I think one of the things I was thinking about in writing about anti-Semitism, I think there is a danger, and you don't do this, but there's a danger of only writing about Jews as a subject of hate, as if they have no agency, right? So, but there are moments in this book of some effective Jewish responses to anti-Semitism, and I wonder if you can share what you learned about various ways that Jews have responded to anti-Semitism throughout American history.
Since we're talking about conspiracy theories, and you did an entire exhibit on the Protocols of the Elders of Zion, that's the granddaddy of all conspiracy theories that continues to cycle down until today. A couple of years ago, there was a copy that found on the desk of an officer, security guard at the U.S. Capitol of the Longworth building. And the Jews have fought back against that conspiracy theory by exposing the lies embedded in it. But the problem is people still believe that. They in fact, is it Hitler who said it? Somebody has said that the fact that they keep complaining about it so much shows that it's true.
He wrote that in Mein Kampf.
In Mein Kampf,
The fact that Jews say this is untrue is the best proof that they're true, right? Which shows kind of the illogic of anti-Semitism and how difficult it is that to use logic to fight back against that illogic.
It's right, which is why when you ask about what works, it's why in the 1960s federal legislation worked.
Yeah. I think often about there's multiple lanes in which you can fight anti-Semitism, right? One is education, which is critically important. One is the law, and one is advocacy. There may be others that are on people's minds, but as we think about combating anti-Semitism, education, I think, is often the slowest of those lanes, right? People want that to move very quickly, but it doesn't very quickly. But we do see multiple examples of the law, right, using the law to effectively fight back.
Yeah. The law and also other kinds of pressure. So, for example, one of the stories that I tell in the book that's quite well known was in 1877 when Joseph Seligman, who was an immigrant to America and who had become a friend of President Ulysses S. Grant. Seligman had gone from essentially a dry goods shop to becoming an important banker. He was even offered the position of Secretary of the Treasury, which he declined. But when he was excluded from a hotel in Saratoga Springs, New York, and hotel adopted a new no Israelites policy. Israelites, by the way, was the nice word for Jews in the 19th century, and the Jewish community actually unofficially boycotted the shops owned by the owner of that hotel. Yeah.
Well, so let's move to campuses.
We're on one.
There's been a lot of focus on campuses in the past 2 years, and I do want to ask you, David mentioned it, your testimony before Congress. I want to get to that, but I wonder if we could take a longer view. There is a longer view of campuses in this book about American Jewish students, about anti-Semitism on campuses. I think there's a history here. This is common. There's a history here that the people who are in the heat of the moment are not paying attention to. I wonder if you would share that history of anti-Semitism on campuses. You mentioned quotas, but maybe some other examples, and then could that history help us in some way in dealing with what we've seen in the past 2 years on campuses?
I think it can, and I'm going to go back to the Catherine Graham story, because when she was at the University of Chicago, she wanted to join a particular club, and the club had never had a Jewish member. And they debated whether or not to let her in, and ultimately the club disbanded rather than admitting her. I think that might be useful for us to think about, because you were talking before about social exclusion, and that's a very powerful example of social exclusion, which cannot be fixed by law, it cannot be fixed by a student conduct council, and I think it is important if people know that story, know how a woman who achieved the greatest heights of American journalism and did some very, very important things as the editor of the Washington Post. There have been feature movies about her, also documentary movies about her. If they would know how that episode was so important that it made it into her memoir that won Pulitzer Prize, maybe they would think twice.
Well, the other thing we're seeing on campuses today, obviously, is anti-Semitism being weaponized by the current administration to attack the mission of universities themselves, to attack the existence of universities themselves. How do you understand that phenomenon of the way that anti-Semitism is being weaponized by this administration to attack the essence of what universities are supposed to be doing?
I'll take you back to the hearings in Congress, but I'm going to start with the one nobody remembers. In November of 2023, I was called to testify before House Judiciary. First thing I should say is, the only reason I get called is I'm local. I'm a metro ride away, it's easy to get to.
It's not the only reason.
Well, but also they knew that I was working on this book, and in that hearing, so that hearing came. It technically was about free speech. It involved some lovely students who were conservatives on our campus, felt that they had been shut down. Also, a young woman from Cornell. This was right after October 7th, and at Cornell there had been a terrible case of a student who threatened to shoot up the Fosher dining hall and rape all the Jewish women. And I was talking with this young woman who was there to talk about this as well. But like a week before that hearing, then candidate Trump had posted a campaign video, which nobody remembers. And in that campaign video, he announced that he was going to tax the endowments of the universities, create a free university, which would not be woke, that was in the video, that's his language, and which would then, its graduates, because they weren't woke, they could come and work for the government. When I got to the next hearing, November of 2023, so what happened then was I got called again for then House Workforce and Education, and I actually, you should know, I actually called my editor. I said, I have to submit written testimony every time I go to Congress. I could have written a whole chapter of this book that is due like in a few months, and I'm really like, should I really do this? So she said, just go one more time. So that was the time where I was sitting with the presidents of Harvard, University of Pennsylvania, and MIT. And I'm very happy to say nobody has yet asked to fire me, as they fired two of those. But in that 5-hour hearing, which most people only remembered the 3 minutes or less, or at least Stefanik went after the presidents, they had asked the presidents, what's the size of your endowment? And I sat there and heard the opening salvo in the attack on higher education. So when we get to where we are now, what happened in the new administration is it's hard to tax the endowments of the universities because it probably requires congressional approval, assuming that you still ask Congress for things. And it's much easier to say, well, we're going to go after the universities because they've allowed all this anti-Semitism. But the reality is, yes, anti-Semitism is a factor in colleges and universities and something we need to deal with. But what does canceling cancer research grants have to do with solving that problem?
What is the connective tissue?
The connective tissue is that it's being recognized to, it gives, I think, it gives the government a way to go after the universities, essentially restructure how medical and scientific research have been done in this country, and also then get them to, basically hold them hostage to pay millions and millions of dollars because they're still eyeing the size of those endowments.
Yeah. Can you tell people what it was like to be there that day during that 5-hour hearing? And I'm curious about your perspective about how it went so awry. I mean, there's so many congressional hearings that don't get the attention that one did, right? But it went so awry.
Right.
I guess I'm curious if you want to talk about what it felt like to be there and what that day was like, but also just how it went so awry at that moment.
I'll say a couple of things. First of all, in that hearing went awry after there had been a break. The Congress calls a vote, all the hearings stop, everybody goes to the floor of the House and they vote. While we were on that break, it was clear that nobody was really getting any traction on the hearing. Nothing was really happening.
You were called by the Democrats.
Yeah, I'm called by the Democrats. So I'm in the back of the
received
Democrats.
any questions at all?
Yeah, I had a few questions in the hearing. Actually, Laura Levin, who's president of the Association for Jewish Studies, decided to pull all my testimony together. So it was I spoke for about 15 minutes, I think, in 5 hours. But I was there because I knew something about the history of anti-Semitism. My written testimony could locate the current moment in the past. What happened after the break was that the Republicans had figured out how to go after them, because everybody gets 5 minutes where they ask a question and they talk to the congressperson talks to the people who are at the witness table. And they kept turning their extra time over to Liz Stefanik, who's having run for governor of New York, so that she could attack the women at the table. And I said women deliberately, because when I walked into the room that day, and this had not happened in my other hearings, the misogyny in that space was unbelievable. 4 women sitting at a witness table, staring out at basically a sea of white men, with a few women sprinkled on the Democratic side and only a couple on the Republican side. And I don't know this for a fact, but I really suspected that they had Stefanik ask those questions so that they couldn't say that it was a man going after the women. And then the other thing was, the presidents at the table, none of them had been in office for more than a year.
And so they don't ask questions
Yeah.
where they started talking about context, right? I'm just curious how
They were prepped by law firms. I know that Sally Kornbluth was prepped also by a PR firm. By this time I had figured out what these hearings were about. The public performances. They're not legal venues, and they got trapped because they couldn't break out of saying calling for genocide for any group on campus, frankly, should be, if it's not, a violation of student conduct code.
Yeah. Well, and many of our colleagues have spoken in very clear ways about what kind of false dichotomy is between fighting anti-Semitism and preserving democracy, right? That this current administration, I think, is trying to push a note that they're trying to push against that, right? But I wonder, in your writing of this book, this intersection between the health of a democratic society and fighting against anti-Semitism, right? That these don't have to be at odds of each other, right? But we're getting this narrative, I think, mostly on campuses around a freedom of speech and fighting anti-Semitism, as if those things have to be dichotomous.
Right. And they shouldn't.
Right, and I guess that's part of what's going on here as well, and we've only seen that, amped up in the, how long is this a hearing? 18 months.
Yeah, it was December 2023.
Yeah. I want to shift topics a little bit. We might come back to that, but I think there's an expectation. I'm a Holocaust educator. I work in institutions that educate about the Holocaust, but there's always a question of why are there so many memorials and museums to the Holocaust in the United States. And I think one of the answers has been that there's an assumption that Holocaust education is an effective way to combat anti-Semitism. So now, in this moment, in these last 2 years, one of the things I hear most in my work is, you failed, right? We see a rise in anti-Semitism, so Holocaust education has failed. Can you put a context around that, around Holocaust education in the United States, and how we got to this moment of people questioning whether Holocaust education actually effectively fights anti-Semitism?
I don't think Holocaust education effectively fights anti-Semitism. Do you?
I don't think it should be the main purpose of Holocaust education. I'm a historian. I think the main purpose of teaching the history of Holocaust should be to teach the history of Holocaust.
Yeah.
But you're talking about history is not very popular at campuses these days, right? So historians and other humanists have to figure out how to market or explain the importance of what they're doing beyond just saying there's a value studying history for the sake of studying history. And I think it's one of the things I worry about the most on campuses right now.
We live in a moment where the humanities are completely under attack, right? That we live in a moment where literally this is happening right now. The labels at the Smithsonian museums in Washington are all being vetted and changed to create a particular kind of narrative of American history that is seen as patriotic and it's a patriotic narrative, really elevates, frankly, white Anglo-Saxon privilege and ignores so many other realities of the American experience. And
But Jews in America ended up in a very funny place in this narrative, right? Maybe not allied or not welcome with groups that they would try to ally with in the past, right? And then not part of the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant narrative either.
Right. This is the classic Jewish problem, right?
Yeah.
Not a religion, not entirely an ethnic group, and how do you define and where why the Jews and where do they fit in? But I would argue that this history, anti-Semitism in American tradition, is actually a patriotic history because it tells one story about this nation that we need to know. We're humanists. We think history has tremendous value, and I really believe this. I mean, I think it's probably part of the reason why that the reception to the book has been so positive is because people know that you can't understand the present if you don't know something about the past.
Yeah. So Holocaust education in the United States, really, I mean, there was Holocaust education before the 1990s, but I think the 1990s were this watershed moment, right? The Museum of Tolerance opens in Los Angeles, so the U.S. Holocaust Memorial Museum opens in Washington, D.C. Schindler's List went Best Picture in 1993, right? So then there's all these curricula around that film. And I think there was a notion, and you write about this, that that was a golden age, that we were living in a golden age, and that the purpose of Holocaust education might not be specific to combating anti-Semitism, but might be some kind of goal about tolerance or even anti-bullying, which I don't think that should be the purpose of Holocaust education. We don't need the Holocaust to teach empathy, right? The other way is to teach empathy. But it speaks to that moment of thinking where I think many American Jews and many American Jewish organizations thought that anti-Semitism was only a problem somewhere else. So you write about that. Your chapter, your post-Holocaust chapter, is actually called "No Age is Golden." How do you explain that moment of optimism? And what was some? Should we read this as, oh, we were so wrong, something was terribly wrong about that note of optimism in the 1990s?
It's not that something was terribly wrong. It's that I think we overestimate the optimism. So the reason for the optimism is that all of a sudden the quotas in the colleges fell, the restricted covenants fell, the places where Jews could never get jobs all of a sudden opened up. There's a moment where, I think it's the early 80s, where a man named Irvin Shapiro becomes head of DuPont. Never, ever would have happened in a company that didn't hire Jews.
Joe
Lieberman, right. So there's that moment, but there's also this, at the very end of the 20th century, in 1999, and I cited this, that there was a survey done by the American Jewish Committee, and they asked Jews a bunch of questions, and one of them was, do you think do you think anti-Semitism is going to get worse in America in the new century? And the vast majority of them say no, or no, about half of them say no. But there was a question before it, which I didn't cite in the book, where it asked, what do you think is the state of anti-Semitism in America now? And 34% of them said it is an extremely serious problem, and another 60% said that it is somewhat of a problem. So they didn't think it was going to get worse, but they would, and couldn't imagine, but they also still believed that anti-Semitism was a factor in American life, even though the barriers to Jewish success in America had disappeared.
Yeah. So I wonder, is one of the reasons around violence, right? That so many Jews who came to America, or it was their parents or their grandparents who came to America, the story for so many American Jews is, my family was fleeing pogroms, right? They came, in the 1880s, the 1890s, or the early 20th century. We were fleeing pogroms. in Russia or elsewhere, and then those who were fleeing Nazism, right, who were lucky enough to make it here. And this notion that somehow, yes, there was violence in the United States sometimes against Jews, but not like over there, wherever over there was, right? But then we look at the last 10 years, right, and we see Tree of Life, we see Poway, the Chabad outside of San Diego where there's a murder, we see an arson attempt on Governor Shapiro's home during Passover, we see murders outside the Capital Jewish Museum. Is this a continuity in American history, or is this some rupture in American history, this level of violent anti-Semitism that we see?
Historians love databases, new databases, right? One of the things I was able to use was a news source called newspapers.com, which digitized local community newspapers. I ended up building a database of over 150 incidents of violence, bombings, even shootings, I think murder, a lot of arson. There was a period in Chicago where there were a whole bunch of synagogues were attacked by arsonists all at the same time. I built that database from 1953 to 2023, and then I started building a different one after October 7. What we're seeing now, the level of violence, it may be somewhat more compressed. It's certainly making headlines, and the reason I built this database was because these were all local incidents that never made national news. I'm not so sure the violence that we're seeing now is a rupture as much as it may be an expansion of something that existed before.
Just a couple more questions, and then we'll move to audience questions. So if you do have questions and you want to put them on a card, please do that with your suit on the top. We'll pass those cards up. I'll ask Pam 2 more questions, and then we'll move on to audience questions. One is, as historians, we like to say, and you say this in the book, that we need time and we need distance to understand an event, right? But then you also say that there's no doubt in your mind that October 7th is a dividing line in Jewish history, but also for Jews in the United States. Can you talk a little bit about that dividing line and what's specific to Jews in the United States about that dividing line?
What's specific about Jews in the United States for the dividing line is that, and this has long been true, what happens in Israel doesn't stay in Israel. It has a tremendous impact on Jews in the United States. 45% of world Jewry lives in Israel, 45% of world Jewry lives in the United States. The relationship, whether it's fraught or it's not fraught, the relationships between the two communities, and I'm not just talking about those of us who have friends there and family there, but that the two communities are deeply intertwined, frankly, in a way that in the early days of the establishment of the state, American Jews were actually kind of concerned what happened, but now we've crossed that line. And the other line that has been crossed is that anti-Semitism has become completely normalized in American life. Things that people once would have thought, like they never would have said, are just part of average, normal daily discourse. And we spend a lot of time, academics spend a lot of time arguing over definitions of anti-Semitism. I'm not a big fan of those arguments because I'm interested, and it goes back to the stories I heard that led me into the book. If someone thinks that they've been a target of anti-Semitism, I'm not going to sit down and have a conversation about whether or not what happened to them fits one of those definitions. It's about their perception.
So one strategy for fighting anti-Semitism has been to point out, maybe we've talked around this, but I wonder your thoughts on it, has been to point out that anti-Semitism is only bad for Jews, that anti-Semitism is bad for American democracy. How might the logic, well, I guess, can you say more about the logic of that argument for those who don't think of it that way? And are there moments across time in U.S. history where we've seen that play out, where we've seen the argument effectively marshaled for people who maybe otherwise would care about anti-Semitism but do care about democracy.
If we care about democracy, we care about democracy for all Americans in this country. And by the way, I would add to that group, I would also add the undocumented immigrants who have spent decades of their lives in this country. And if we care about, if we want to elevate democracy, then we want to elevate all the voices and all peoples that comprise this very complicated nation. And Jews will obviously benefit from that, but we're like 2% of the population. I mean, it's hard to believe, such a small percentage. And that if we attack one group, whatever group it is, whether it's immigrants or it's Asian Americans or it's people of color, then all the others also come under attack. And that's been going on, unfortunately, in this country now for more than a decade.
Do we have cards, Sarah? All right, I've got one.
Okay, cool.
All right, this is for Sue. I'm just going to read it. I've been feeling that the current methods to combat anti-Semitism aren't working. Policing bad speech doesn't seem to change anyone's minds. Moreover, people accused of committing anti-Semitism don't seem to take it seriously. What do you think we can be doing differently to fight this problem on campuses?
The first thing I should say is if I knew the answer, I would have a different job and probably a higher pay rate. I hear what you're saying. I have literally been in conversations, on panels that my university has organized where I'm sitting next to somebody and he announces, I am not anti-Semitic, I just don't believe Israel has a right to exist. And then, whatever he could do if that's the destruction of Israel. And some colleges, and I've seen that this is in NYU's policies that explain their student conduct code. They have begun to include there that using Zionist or Zionism is actually, they understand it that can be used as a form of hate speech. That's not a solution to the problem, but at least it's a recognition of the problem.
Here's another one from student, and maybe you can explain some of the terms here. Yeah. Right. But do you think the IRA, the International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance, definition of anti-Semitism is useful in fighting anti-Semitism? Should universities use it? And this university has adopted it. If not, what other definition should they use? The Jerusalem definition? You mentioned this a little bit, that you're not a fan of definitions, but maybe you can talk more about these three definitions that do exist and why they've become, at least within Jewish organizations and Jewish and university campuses to some extent, such a hot issue.
Right. The International Holocaust Remembrance Alliance was established probably in the 20-teens, early 20-teens, and it did two things. One, it advocated for spelling anti-Semitism without a hyphen and without a capital S, and it was successful in that, but you will see that the Trump administration has actually returned to spelling anti-Semitism in another way. And it developed a definition of anti-Semitism, which the definition is fine. The problem lies in the examples that can be seen as potentially quashing free speech. Frankly, the problem also lies in the fact that it doesn't say when they quash free speech, and they're all kind of, maybe in this particular instance, it could quash free speech. The definition was developed so that European countries would have a standard for tracking anti-Semitism across the board. The IRA definition, some of the leaders behind it had worked for the American Jewish Committee, And ultimately, one of those figures, Ken Stern, has repudiated the way in which it has become used. So it was meant essentially to give governments in different countries one kind of similar, same metric for being able to develop data on anti-Semitic incidents. And then it has spread. Actually, the first time I was in Congress was in a hearing over whether or not Congress should legislate the iron definition, and it didn't, decided not to, because the problem is these definitions won't even change over time. And then different groups of Jewish intellectuals have pushed back. It created the Jerusalem Declaration, and they've also created the Nexus Declaration. And they're longer documents explaining when something is anti-Semitic and when it is not anti-Semitic. The problem, I think, is that mostly the people who are having these conversations are mostly Jewish intellectuals and public policy people, right?
Yeah, I agree. There's a lot of questions here about universities. I'm going to try to kind of combine the thoughts in a lot of these questions, and we'll do 2 more questions. Is that okay? 2 more questions. So one just says, please comment about understanding anti-Zionism and anti-Semitism. And then another is a little bit more specific. Campuses, how do you think about Title VI being used to treat certain instances of anti-Zionism as anti-Semitism after the 2019 executive order? Should universities and Jewish organizations keep that in their toolbox?
Anti-Zionism, this is what the Jewish community always says. Criticizing the policies of the government of Israel is not anti-Semitic. We're Americans, many of us criticize the policies of our own country. However, when it crosses certain kinds of lines, calling for the destruction of the state, declaring that it is not legitimate, using classic anti-Semitic tropes and ideas about Israel and Israelis, then it has crossed the line to anti-Semitism. The problem is in the sense that we've spent a lot of time thinking about anti-Semitism. We haven't spent so much time theorizing and really thinking about anti-Zionism. And there's a young scholar, whose name escapes me at the moment, who's been talking about that maybe what we need to do is to understand anti-Zionism as adjacent to anti-Semitism, but that actually it is its own form of prejudice and discrimination. I just discovered his work, but it's making me think a lot about this, and it might give us a handle for understanding this.
All right, we'll do 1 more question and then let you sign books. I asked a form of this, but I didn't ask it this way. I'm just curious what you think. Do you think weaponizing anti-Semitism to dismantle universities and for other purposes of the weaponization of anti-Semitism will ultimately have the effect of increasing anti-Semitism as people once again blame the Jews?
Absolutely. And I'm really, I would prefer to end on a note of hope, but I'm really,
So how do you end up?
really, well, all right, I'll come to that in a second. I'm really deeply concerned about this. American colleges and universities, the research, scientific, medical establishment in this country, it's world class. It's why so many foreign students want to come here to study and learn. And if this attack on the universities causes the university system and higher education in the United States to lose its position of preeminence in the world and cede it maybe to the Chinese next, that in the end, people are going to remember, why did that happen? It happened because of the Jews. So that is very, very frightening. As for a moment of hope, I'm hopeful that maybe the government will reopen. I'll be able to get home. I am hopeful that maybe we will right our course and and steer a new path forward.
All right, so everyone, I can't thank Pam Nadell enough, but please join me and please buy the book. Thanks for being here.
That was cool.